Some sounds never leave a Marine, no matter how many years pass or how quiet the world becomes. Daniel Carter learned that on a wind-washed stretch of coastline where the nights felt wider than the ocean itself. The house sat alone at the edge of a narrow gravel road outside a small North Carolina town, a modest wooden place with a porch that faced miles of dark water and salt grass. Most evenings followed the same slow rhythm. The screen door creaked, the porch light hummed, and the Atlantic wind carried the scent of salt and damp wood through the railings. Daniel would sit in the old chair he built with his own hands after coming home from service, boots resting against the boards, a mug of black coffee cooling beside him. For 3 years this quiet routine had been the closest thing to peace he knew. War had a way of echoing long after it ended, not with explosions or chaos, but with smaller things. A certain smell, a shape moving at the edge of vision, or sometimes a memory that arrived without warning. On a small hook by the door hung a worn dog tag attached to a faded collar, the leather cracked from desert heat and years of training fields. Rex, German Shepherd, military working dog. Daniel never moved it. Some nights the collar would shift gently when the wind slipped through the porch boards, and the metal tag would tap once against the wood with a quiet sound that seemed too familiar to ignore. But tonight the wind was different. The air carried a strange stillness, the kind that makes the ocean sound farther away than it really is. Daniel was halfway through his coffee when he heard it. One bark. Low, sharp, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the night, like a memory returning to life. Daniel didn't move at first. His hand stayed wrapped around the mug as his eyes slowly lifted toward the darkness beyond the porch light. The yard stretched nearly 50 yards before fading into a patch of thin trees that marked the start of the coastal woods. Nothing moved there, only shadows shifting with the breeze. He exhaled slowly, the breath fogging faintly in the cool air. 3 years, he thought. 3 years since the military report arrived with words that sounded official but never felt real. Missing. During mission incident. Presumed lost. Rex had been more than a K9 partner. He had been the steady heartbeat beside Daniel during long patrols and quiet watches before sunrise. A dog trained to listen, to warn, to protect. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence settle again. Maybe it was another dog somewhere along the coast. Maybe a stray wandering through the dunes. That was the reasonable answer. But Marines learn to trust another kind of instinct too, the quiet signal that rises somewhere deeper than logic. The porch boards creaked softly as Daniel stood. The collar by the door swayed once as he brushed past it. He stepped out into the yard, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The night air felt cooler away from the porch light. For a few seconds nothing happened. Only wind moving through the grass. Then it came again. Another bark. Same tone. Same rhythm. Daniel froze in place, his eyes narrowing toward the dark tree line 50 yards away. Because there was something about that sound that no Marine ever forgets. It wasn't just a bark. It was a signal. Daniel Carter had heard thousands of barks in his life, but a trained Marine never confuses noise with meaning. The sound drifting from the trees carried a rhythm that belonged to training fields and long patrols beneath foreign skies. It was short, controlled, deliberate. Not the wandering bark of a neighborhood dog chasing shadows in the dark. This one had purpose. Daniel remained still in the yard, boots planted in the gravel, the cold Atlantic wind brushing past his jacket as if the ocean itself were listening with him. The trees beyond the grass moved gently, thin branches whispering together in the dark. For a moment nothing else happened. Then the silence deepened in a way that made the world feel watchful. Daniel slowly turned his head toward the porch where the faded collar hung beside the door. Even from 20 feet away, he could see the dull glint of the dog tag swaying lightly on its ring. Rex. The name carried weight, even after 3 long years. Some partnerships in the Marines are built on orders and discipline, but a K9 team is something different. It is trust sharpened by long hours and quiet understanding. Rex had not been just a dog trained to track scents or follow commands. He had been Daniel's second set of senses, the steady presence that noticed danger before a human mind could put it into words. Daniel remembered the first day they met at the training yard in Texas, sunlight reflecting off rows of metal kennels, while a young German shepherd with alert brown eyes studied him with calm intensity. The instructors said the bond between handler and dog could not be forced. It had to grow through miles walked together and mornings that began before the sun. Rex had learned Daniel's voice. Daniel had learned Rex's signals. 3 kinds of bark. That was what the trainers always said. One for curiosity, one for alert, and one that meant something serious enough to stop a patrol in its tracks. The sound Daniel heard tonight was the third one. He knew it the same way a musician knows the right note without needing to see the instrument. His heartbeat slowed as his mind tried to place the moment somewhere inside reason. Rex had disappeared during a mission far from this quiet coastline. The official report had arrived in a clean white envelope that smelled faintly of paper and ink. Missing during incident. Search unsuccessful. Daniel had read the words twice, then folded the page carefully and placed Rex's collar beside the door where it remained to this day. The Marine Corps teaches many things, but it does not teach how to say goodbye to a partner that saved your life more than once. Another breeze rolled in from the ocean, carrying the distant sound of waves breaking against the dark shore. Daniel stepped forward across the grass, moving slowly, each step deliberate the way patrol training had taught him years before. 50 yards ahead, the thin tree line formed a shadowy wall where moonlight barely reached the ground. The bark did not come again right away. Instead, the woods seemed to hold their breath, waiting. Daniel stopped near the edge of the yard and listened. Then it came again. One sharp bark, clear and unmistakable, echoing between the trunks as if the forest itself were repeating a message. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, but recognition. Because that signal had once meant only one thing. Rex was trying to warn him about something. The signal hung in the air for several seconds after the sound faded, as if the trees themselves were holding on to it. Daniel Carter did not move right away. Years of Marine training had carved patience into his instincts, the quiet discipline of listening before acting. The coastal woods ahead looked ordinary at first glance, just a narrow stretch of pine and oak that ran along the edge of the marsh behind his property. During the day, sunlight poured through those branches and lit the ground with soft patches of gold. But at night the place changed. Moonlight slipped between the trunks in thin silver lines, leaving long shadows that moved slowly whenever the wind touched the leaves. Daniel took another step forward, boots pressing softly into the damp grass. The porch light behind him now felt distant, a warm square of yellow fading against the darker yard. 50 yards ahead, the tree line waited in stillness. The ocean wind shifted again and carried a mixture of scents through the air, salt from the Atlantic, damp soil from the marsh, and something else Daniel could not immediately place. It was faint, but it stirred a memory deep in the back of his mind. For a moment, he simply stood there breathing slowly, letting the night speak the way it used to during long patrols years ago. Rex had always been the first to notice small changes like that. The German Shepherd could read the world through smell and sound the way a Marine reads a map. Daniel remembered walking beside him across quiet terrain before sunrise, the dog moving with steady confidence, ears forward, nose working the wind. Sometimes Rex would stop and give a single controlled bark, the exact sound Daniel had just heard tonight. Not loud, never frantic, just clear enough to say something important needed attention. Daniel's eyes moved across the dark woods again, searching the spaces between the trees. Nothing stepped into view. No movement, no shape, only the gentle sway of branches and the whisper of dry needles brushing against one another. Yet the feeling remained, that quiet signal inside his chest telling him the sound had not been random. He glanced down at the ground near the edge of the yard. The soil here stayed soft because the marsh water crept close during high tide. In the faint moonlight, Daniel could see shallow impressions scattered across the damp earth. At first they looked like ordinary marks left by small animals that wandered through the area at night. But when he crouched down and looked closer, the shapes became clearer. 4 narrow prints, spaced evenly, the front pads slightly larger than the back. Dog tracks. Daniel reached out and touched the edge of one mark with his fingers. The soil was fresh, still holding the clean shape of the print without wind or water softening the edges. Whatever had walked here had passed only moments ago. The Marine slowly rose back to his feet, his gaze lifting toward the dark woods again. Somewhere beyond those trees the night waited quietly. Then the sound came once more. One bark, firm and unmistakable, echoing through the narrow corridor of trunks ahead of him. This time it came from deeper inside the forest, perhaps 30 yards beyond the first line of trees. Daniel felt the same recognition settle over him again, calm but certain. That was not a stray dog wandering the coast. That was a signal meant for him. And the message had always meant the same thing. Follow. Daniel Carter stepped beyond the edge of his yard and into the narrow corridor of trees, the grass giving way to soft forest soil beneath his boots. The moment he crossed that invisible boundary, the night changed around him. The porch light behind him faded into a distant glow, and the sounds of the ocean softened until they felt like a memory rather than a presence. Pine needles carpeted the ground, muting his footsteps as he moved slowly between the trunks. The air inside the woods carried a cooler breath, mixed with the scent of damp bark and earth that had not seen sunlight since morning. Daniel moved carefully, eyes adjusting to the dim silver light filtering through the branches overhead. The bark had come from somewhere ahead, deeper among the trees, but the forest now stood silent again, as if it had already said what it needed to say. He paused beside a narrow pine trunk and listened the way he had learned to listen during quiet patrol nights years ago. Not just with his ears, but with his whole awareness. The wind brushed gently through the canopy above him, producing a soft whisper that drifted across the darkness. Somewhere far off an owl called once, and then fell silent. But beneath those ordinary sounds, Daniel sensed the same quiet signal pulling him forward. He glanced down again and found the trail continuing clearly across the damp forest floor. The dog tracks were easy to recognize now. 4 narrow impressions, evenly spaced, moving deeper into the woods in a straight, deliberate line. Whoever made them was not wandering. The animal had a destination. Daniel followed the prints slowly, stepping around fallen branches and patches of moss that glowed faintly in the moonlight. After 20 yards, the trees grew closer together and the ground dipped slightly, forming a shallow path that ran toward the marsh behind the forest. Daniel remembered this area well. During the day, he sometimes walked here with a cup of coffee, listening to the wind move across the tall grass near the water. But tonight, every step carried the weight of something older, something that reached back to the years he had spent working beside a German shepherd who understood signals before words. Rex had always led like this. When the dog sensed something important, he would move ahead just far enough for Daniel to follow without losing sight of him. The distance was never random. 20 yards, sometimes 30. Enough space to guide, never enough to disappear. Daniel slowed as he realized the pattern unfolding in front of him. The tracks were not wandering at all. They were pacing him, appearing just ahead of where he walked as though the animal had passed through only moments earlier. A faint breeze drifted through the trees again, and Daniel caught that strange scent once more. Metal. Not strong, not sharp, just a subtle trace carried through the night air. His marine instincts stirred immediately. Rex had been trained to detect that exact kind of scent, the quiet chemical notes that most people would never notice. Daniel stopped walking and lifted his head slightly, letting the wind move across his face so he could catch the direction. The smell drifted from somewhere deeper beyond the path, perhaps another 40 yards through the trees. He listened again. The forest held still for a long moment, as if the entire landscape had paused to watch what he would do next. Then the bark returned. One short call, clear and focused, echoing through the pines ahead of him. Not closer this time. Farther away. Leading him onward the same way Rex had done on long patrols when something important waited just beyond the next line of trees. Daniel Carter moved deeper along the narrow forest path, each step guided by the faint impressions in the damp soil ahead of him. The air felt cooler beneath the thick canopy, and the scent of salt from the ocean had almost disappeared now, replaced by the quiet smell of pine needles and dark earth. Somewhere beyond the trees the marsh stretched wide beneath the moon, but the woods themselves held a stillness that made every small sound seem sharper. Daniel paused for a moment and listened again, letting the silence settle around him the way it used to during long patrols before sunrise. He had learned years ago that silence was never truly empty. It was full of signals if a person knew how to hear them. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant wing beat of a night bird, the slow shift of wind across branches high above the ground. Tonight another signal threaded through that quiet, something older than logic and harder to explain. Daniel looked down and saw the dog tracks again, clear beneath the moonlight filtering through the trees. The prints moved forward in a straight line, never wandering, never circling. Whoever left them was guiding him somewhere with steady intention. He followed carefully, stepping over fallen limbs and patches of low brush that caught faint silver light along their edges. After another 30 yards, the ground dipped slightly toward a narrow clearing where the trees opened just enough for the moon to brighten the forest floor. The trail of prints continued across the clearing and disappeared briefly in a stretch of dry leaves before returning again near the far side. Daniel slowed his pace and studied the marks closely. They were fresh. The edges remained crisp, undisturbed by wind or shifting soil. Whatever animal had passed through here had done so only moments earlier. He crouched down and touched one print with his fingertips, feeling the cool dampness of the ground. The size matched what he remembered. Not a small stray, not a coyote or fox from the marsh. A large dog. A German shepherd would leave tracks just like this. Daniel remained there for several seconds, his mind drifting back to mornings long ago when Rex used to lead him through similar terrain during training exercises. The dog always moved with calm purpose, never wasting energy, never rushing. Rex had understood that the job was not about speed. It was about reading the world one quiet signal at a time. Daniel rose slowly and looked ahead again. The forest beyond the clearing grew darker, the trunks thicker and closer together as the ground sloped toward the marshland behind his property. The faint metallic scent drifted through the air again, stronger now, but still subtle, like something carried on the wind from a distance. Daniel breathed in carefully, letting memory guide recognition. Rex had been trained to notice exactly that kind of smell. Even the smallest trace of unfamiliar metal hidden where it did not belong would make the German shepherd stop and deliver that same short bark Daniel had heard tonight. As if answering the thought, the sound returned once more from somewhere deeper in the woods. One firm bark, clear and controlled, echoing softly through the trees ahead. Daniel felt a calm certainty settle into his chest. Whoever was leaving those tracks was not lost, and the signal was not random. It was the same message Rex had given countless times before during their years together. Something important was waiting farther ahead, and the dog wanted him to see it. Daniel Carter moved past the clearing and into the darker stretch of forest where the trees grew closer together and the ground sloped gently toward the marshland. The moonlight thinned beneath the thicker canopy, leaving the forest floor painted in long, quiet shadows. Each step he took carried the calm precision that years of marine training had built into him, slow and deliberate, the kind of movement that allowed the world to reveal its details instead of disturbing them. Pine needles softened the sound of his boots while the faint breeze drifted through the branches overhead. Somewhere behind him the distant ocean continued its steady rhythm against the shore, but here inside the woods the sound felt far away, almost like it belonged to another place entirely. Daniel followed the line of dog tracks deeper between the trees. They continued forward with the same steady spacing, never wandering, always guiding him along the narrow natural path that wound toward the marsh. Dim light. The dog prints continued across the firmer earth, though they were lighter now, more subtle, barely visible except where the moon caught the edges just right. Whoever left them was still moving ahead of him, still leading him somewhere specific. The quiet metallic scent drifted across the air again, stronger now, enough for Daniel to recognize the same sharp note that Rex used to notice long before any human could. The memory of training fields returned with surprising clarity. Rex had always lifted his head when that scent appeared, ears forward, body still, and then the signal would come. One short bark. Not loud, just enough to say something was not right in the world around them. Daniel stood slowly and listened again. The forest seemed to lean closer in the darkness, every branch and shadow forming a silent corridor ahead of him. For several seconds there was only the whisper of wind through pine needles. Then the sound came once more. The bark echoed through the trees ahead, slightly farther now, perhaps 40 yards deeper into the woods. Daniel turned toward the direction of the sound and stepped forward again. The path curved gently to the right, and the trees began to thin just enough for a faint strip of moonlight to reach the ground ahead. As he moved closer, he noticed something unusual resting between two large pines near the edge of the light. At first it looked like nothing more than a dark shape among the shadows, but as he approached the outline became clearer. Metal. A vehicle. Daniel stopped several yards away and studied the shape carefully. It appeared to be an older pickup truck, parked at an angle where the forest path widened near the marsh. The vehicle sat quietly beneath the trees with no lights and no sound, as though it had been left there hours earlier. The faint metallic scent in the air now made more sense. Daniel took another slow step forward, his eyes scanning the ground around the truck. The dog tracks led directly toward it. Then they stopped just short of the rear tire. The forest held its breath again. Daniel listened closely, every sense focused on the stillness around him. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then from somewhere beyond the truck, deeper in the trees near the edge of the marsh, the bark returned once again. Clear and patient, the same signal Rex had used countless times before. Daniel felt a quiet certainty rise inside him as he looked toward the sound. Whatever had guided him here was still waiting just ahead. Daniel Carter remained still for several seconds, studying the quiet pickup truck parked beneath the tall pines. The vehicle looked old but intact, its dark body reflecting faint strips of moonlight that slipped through the branches above. No interior lights glowed behind the windows, and the engine had long since gone cold. It sat there like something forgotten by the world, yet the metallic scent drifting through the air told a different story. Daniel stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching softly on the thin layer of gravel mixed into the soil near the truck. The ground here had been disturbed recently. Tire marks curved gently through the trees behind the vehicle, faint but visible where the moonlight touched the earth. Whoever drove this truck had brought it deep enough into the woods to stay hidden from the road, yet not so deep that the marsh water would swallow the tires. It was a careful place to stop. Daniel walked along the side of the truck, his eyes scanning the ground and the surrounding trees the same way he had done on countless patrols years ago. The dog tracks were still there. They moved straight toward the rear of the vehicle and then stopped just behind the right tire. Daniel crouched again and touched the ground beside the last visible print. The soil was soft and cool beneath his fingers, still holding the shape of the track as clearly as if it had been pressed there moments earlier. He followed the direction of the prints with his eyes, imagining the dog standing right there, facing toward the darker section of forest that stretched beyond the truck. A breeze passed quietly between the trees and carried the metallic scent again, stronger this time, mixed with the faint smell of rubber and cold steel. Daniel stood and looked toward the back of the truck bed. Several large containers rested inside, their shapes barely visible beneath a worn canvas tarp tied down with rope. Nothing moved. The entire scene felt strangely quiet, as though the woods themselves were waiting for him to notice something important. Daniel listened carefully again. The forest answered only with wind brushing across pine, needles high overhead. Then from somewhere beyond the truck, perhaps another 20 yards deeper toward the marsh, the bark returned. One sure call, calm and certain. It echoed softly between the trees before fading into the night air. Daniel felt the same steady recognition settle into his chest. Rex used to bark exactly like that when he wanted Daniel to keep moving forward. Not because danger was immediate, but because something needed to be found. Daniel stepped past the truck and continued along the faint path leading toward the marsh edge. The ground became softer again, damp from the slow tide that crept through the low grass at night. Moonlight spilled more freely here where the trees thinned near the water. The silver glow stretched across the open marsh like a quiet lake of light. Daniel moved carefully, his eyes adjusting to the wider view. Then he saw it. At the edge of the marsh grass, about 30 yards ahead, a shape stood perfectly still. The outline was unmistakable even in the dim light. Tall ears, broad chest, a strong, steady silhouette that every Marine who had worked with a K-9 partner would recognize instantly. The German Shepherd did not move. It simply stood there facing him across the narrow stretch of grass, watching with calm patience as though it had been waiting all along. Daniel Carter stood motionless at the edge of the marsh grass, his eyes fixed on the silhouette 30 yards ahead. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still beneath the pale wash of moonlight, tall ears lifted, body balanced in that familiar posture Daniel had seen countless times during training and patrols. For a moment the world around them seemed to fade into quiet distance. The whisper of wind across the marsh slowed. Even the distant ocean felt quieter, as if the coastline itself had paused to witness the strange meeting unfolding beneath the night sky. Daniel took a slow breath, the cool air filling his lungs as his mind tried to place what his eyes were seeing. The shape was unmistakable. A large German shepherd with the strong outline of a working dog, broad shoulders, and steady stance. Yet something about the stillness of the animal made the moment feel almost unreal, as though memory and present time had quietly crossed paths in the middle of the marsh. Daniel took a single step forward. The damp grass bent softly beneath his boots, releasing the faint scent of wet earth into the air. The dog did not move. It simply watched him, calm and patient, its dark figure outlined by the silver light spilling across the open ground. Another breeze drifted across the marsh, and the tall grass swayed gently around the animal's legs. Daniel felt the same quiet certainty rising again in his chest, the same instinct that had guided him through long nights beside Rex years ago. He had learned back then that trust between a Marine and a K9 partner was not built through commands alone. It grew through small signals, through silent understanding that needed no explanation. The dog ahead of him lowered its head slightly, not in fear but in recognition, and then it stepped backward one pace toward the darker edge of the marsh trail. The movement was calm and deliberate, the same way Rex used to guide him forward during patrols when something important waited just out of sight. Daniel stopped again, watching carefully. The German shepherd turned its head briefly toward the open marsh, and then looked back at him, holding his gaze for a second that felt longer than it should. The message was clear without a single sound. Follow. Daniel moved forward slowly, crossing the narrow stretch of grass that separated them. The moonlight brightened the scene as he stepped closer, revealing more detail in the dog's form. The coat carried the deep black and tan pattern common to working German shepherds, though the fur along the shoulders looked rougher than he remembered from years past. The animal did not approach him yet. Instead, it walked another few yards toward a narrow trail that curved along the edge of the marsh reeds. Daniel followed, the quiet rhythm of his steps matching the dog's steady pace. They moved together for nearly 20 yards along the marsh edge until the dog stopped beside a low rise of ground where the grass grew shorter. From here, the pickup truck back in the woods was barely visible through the trees. The German shepherd stood beside the rise and looked down toward the ground as if drawing attention to something hidden there. Daniel stepped closer and followed the direction of the dog's gaze. In the moonlight, he could see faint shapes partially buried beneath the grass and soil, small metal cylinders arranged carefully near the edge of the rise. The metallic scent in the air suddenly made sense. Daniel lifted his head slowly, his eyes shifting back toward the German shepherd. The dog stood calmly beside him now, silent and steady, just as it had been on countless missions long ago when it had guided him to something the human eye could not yet see. Daniel Carter remained kneeling beside the low rise of marsh grass, his eyes fixed on the faint metal shapes half hidden beneath the soil. The moonlight reflected softly along their curved surfaces, enough to reveal that they were not random debris carried in by storms. The objects had been placed carefully, spaced with quiet intention along the edge of the rise where the ground overlooked the narrow marsh trail. Daniel did not touch them. Years of Marine training had taught him that sometimes the most important action was restraint. Instead, he studied the arrangement closely, letting memory guide his understanding the same way it had during long missions overseas. The metallic scent drifting through the night air grew stronger here, mixing with the cool smell of marsh water and wet grass. It was the exact kind of scent Rex had been trained to recognize. Daniel slowly stood and took one careful step back from the hidden cylinders, keeping his movements slow and steady so he would not disturb the ground. The German shepherd beside him remained calm and silent, watching him with the same focused patience that working dogs carried during a task. The dog's ears were forward, its body still, as though it understood that the discovery had reached an important moment. Daniel turned his head slightly and looked back toward the forest path where the pickup truck rested beneath the trees. From this distance, the vehicle appeared only as a dark shape between the trunks, but now the entire scene formed a quiet pattern in his mind. The hidden truck, the containers beneath the tarp, the buried metal cylinders near the marsh edge. Someone had brought materials into this isolated stretch of forest and arranged them with care, believing the place was quiet enough that no one would notice. Daniel exhaled slowly, the cool air rising in a faint cloud before fading into the night. Rex had always been the one who noticed what others overlooked, even the smallest trace of unfamiliar metal hidden in. The wrong place would make the German shepherd stop and deliver that calm, precise bark that meant something important had been found. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the dog standing beside him. The moonlight now revealed more detail in the animal's face. The strong black and tan coat was rougher than he remembered from years ago, and one ear carried a slight bend near the tip as if time had left its mark there. But the posture was unmistakable. Alert, steady, focused on the same quiet duty that had defined their partnership before the war ended. Daniel felt a slow wave of recognition move through him. He spoke softly, almost without thinking. Rex. The name left his lips like something returning home after a long absence. The German shepherd's ears lifted slightly at the sound, and the dog turned its head toward him. For a moment the world held perfectly still. Daniel took another step closer, studying the dog's eyes in the pale moonlight. Those eyes had always carried a calm intelligence, the steady awareness of a partner who understood the mission as clearly as any Marine beside him. The dog watched him quietly for a second that felt both new and strangely familiar. Then the German shepherd moved forward one step and lowered its head just enough to touch its nose gently against Daniel's hand. The contact was light and brief, but it carried a warmth that no memory could imitate. Daniel felt his breath catch in his chest as the truth settled quietly into the night air around them. Daniel Carter kept his hand where it was, feeling the warmth of the German shepherd's nose resting gently against his fingers. For a moment neither of them moved. The marsh wind whispered through the tall grass, and the moonlight stretched across the quiet water behind them, but everything else seemed to fade away. Daniel slowly lowered himself to one knee so that he could see the dog more clearly. Up close the details became undeniable. The familiar black mask across the face, the strong tan fur along the shoulders, the slight bend in the right ear that had happened during a training exercise years ago when Rex had leaped over a wooden barrier a fraction too quickly. Time had changed the dog. The coat looked rougher, streaked with faint gray along the muzzle, and the body carried the lean shape of an animal that had survived a long journey on its own. But the eyes had not changed. Those steady brown eyes still held the calm focus of a working dog who understood exactly what his purpose was. Daniel felt his throat tighten slightly as the reality settled deeper inside him. 3 years ago, he had stood in a quiet office reading a report that said his partner had not survived a mission overseas. He had folded that paper carefully and carried Rex's collar home with him, believing the story had ended somewhere far away under a foreign sky. Yet here the dog stood beside him in the cool North Carolina night, breathing softly, alive and patient, as if no time had passed at all. Daniel reached forward slowly and placed his hand against the side of Rex's neck. The fur felt coarse but warm beneath his palm, and the dog leaned gently into the touch with the quiet familiarity of a partner who remembered every mile they had walked together. Rex gave a soft exhale through his nose, and then lifted his head slightly, looking back toward the rise of ground where the metal cylinders lay hidden beneath the grass. The message was clear even without sound. The mission was not finished yet. Daniel followed the direction of Rex's gaze and studied the area again. The arrangement of the buried cylinders and the containers in the truck suggested careful planning, the kind of setup that someone hoped would remain unnoticed in an isolated stretch of marshland. Rex had not led him here simply to reunite. The dog had done exactly what he had always done during their years in uniform. He had found something that did not belong and guided his handler to it. Daniel took a slow breath and looked back toward the forest where the truck waited between the trees. The quiet path they had walked together was now clear in his mind. Rex had barked just enough to draw him from the porch. The tracks had guided him through the woods. The signals had led him step by step until the hidden discovery revealed itself beneath the moonlight. Daniel gently scratched behind Rex's ear, a small gesture that had always been their way of acknowledging a job well done. The German shepherd's tail moved once through the grass in a slow, calm motion. Then Rex stepped forward again and turned his head toward the distant trees, as if reminding Daniel that the night's work was not yet complete. Daniel Carter rose slowly from the marsh grass, the quiet weight of the moment settling around him like the night air itself. Rex stood beside him, steady and calm, the way he always had when a task remained unfinished. The wind moved gently across the marsh, bending the tall reeds in slow waves that shimmered under the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, the Atlantic rolled against the shore with a quiet rhythm, a reminder that the world continued its endless motion even while one small corner of it had paused for a reunion 3 years overdue. Daniel looked once more toward the rise of ground where the metal cylinders rested beneath the soil. The discovery was clear now. Someone had hidden materials here carefully, believing the isolated marshland and the dark woods would keep their secret. But they had not counted on a German shepherd trained to notice the smallest signal in the air. Rex had done what he had always done. He had found what did not belong. Daniel placed a steady hand along the dog's shoulder and felt the quiet strength beneath the coarse fur. Rex turned his head slightly and met his gaze, those calm brown eyes carrying the same quiet understanding they had shared on patrols long ago. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself a small breath of disbelief. 3 years of silence. 3 years of believing the partnership had ended beneath a distant sky. And yet here the dog stood beside him once again, as if the bond between them had simply waited for the right moment to return. Rex shifted his weight and looked toward the dark forest path where the pickup truck rested among the pines. The message did not need words. Daniel nodded slightly and stood fully, brushing the damp grass from his knee. He took one last careful look at the buried cylinders and the marsh trail around them, committing the details to memory the same way Marines are trained to study a scene before leaving it behind. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and removed his phone. The screen glowed softly in the night as he stepped a few yards away from the rise to make the call. His voice remained calm and steady, as he spoke with the local authorities, explaining only what needed to be said. A hidden vehicle in the woods. Suspicious materials near the marsh. Coordinates that would lead them directly to the place Rex had revealed. When the call ended, Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked down at the dog beside him. Rex watched him patiently, tail resting low in the grass, as though waiting for the next instruction that had guided their partnership for so many miles in the past. Daniel knelt again and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's head, a quiet gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. The German shepherd gave a slow breath and leaned gently into the contact. For a few seconds the two of them remained there beneath the moonlight, Marine and K9 reunited not through chance, but through the same loyalty that had always defined their bond. Then Rex lifted his head and looked toward the forest path once more, ears forward, ready to move when the moment called for it. And Daniel Carter understood that some partnerships do not end when the mission seems finished. Sometimes they simply wait until the next signal appears in the quiet night. The night remained calm around the marsh as Daniel Carter and Rex waited together beneath the pale stretch of moonlight. Time seemed to move slowly in that quiet place where the forest met the water, each minute passing with the soft whisper of wind moving through the reeds. Daniel stood beside the German shepherd and watched the dark tree line where the path disappeared back toward the hidden truck. Somewhere beyond those pines, the gravel road and the sleeping town rested in silence, unaware of the discovery waiting here among the marsh grass. Rex remained steady at his side, his posture relaxed but alert in the way only a trained working dog could maintain. Every few seconds the dog lifted his nose slightly, catching the breeze and reading the air the same way he had done on distant missions years ago. Daniel noticed the small movements and felt a quiet sense of familiarity settle deeper in his chest. The partnership between handler and dog had always been built on moments like this. Silent awareness shared between two living beings who trusted each other without needing to speak. The distant sound of tires eventually reached them, faint at first as it carried through the trees from the narrow coastal road. Daniel turned his head toward the forest path and listened carefully. A pair of headlights appeared far away between the trunks, their soft glow weaving slowly through the woods as the vehicle approached the hidden clearing where the pickup truck waited. The authorities had arrived sooner than he expected. Rex watched the approaching lights with calm attention, but did not move. The dog simply remained beside Daniel as the vehicle stopped near the forest path, and two figures stepped out beneath the dim beams of their flashlights. The officers moved cautiously at first, scanning the quiet woods until Daniel raised a hand to guide them closer. When they reached the marsh edge, Daniel explained what Rex had led him to find, his voice steady and clear while he pointed toward the low rise where the metal cylinders rested beneath the grass. The officers examined the area carefully, their lights sweeping across the ground while one of them spoke into a radio to request additional support. Throughout the entire moment, Rex stood beside Daniel without making a sound, watching the scene with the calm patience of a dog who already knew the task had been completed. After several minutes, one of the officers lowered his flashlight and looked at the German shepherd with quiet surprise. "That dog found this?" he asked. Daniel nodded once and rested his hand gently against Rex's shoulder. The officer studied the animal again for a moment before giving a slow, respectful nod of his own. "Good dog," he said softly. Rex's ears shifted slightly at the sound of the words, but he remained still, his attention drifting back toward Daniel as though the praise belonged somewhere else. The marsh wind moved across the grass once more, carrying the scent of salt from the distant ocean. Daniel looked down at Rex and felt a quiet realization settle into his heart. For 3 years, he had believed the story of their partnership had ended. Yet tonight the same loyal signal had returned through the darkness, guiding him step by step through the woods until the truth revealed itself beneath the moonlight. Some bonds between a Marine and his K-9 partner do not disappear with time. They simply wait patiently until the moment they are needed again. The marsh slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. After the officers finished their work near the rise of grass, more vehicles eventually arrived through the narrow forest path, their headlights moving carefully between the pines before stopping near the hidden truck. The beams of flashlights drifted across the ground as the authorities examined the site, speaking in low voices while documenting everything Rex had revealed. Daniel Carter remained a few steps away from the activity, standing beside the German shepherd at the edge of the marsh where the silver moonlight stretched across the reeds. The cool wind carried the familiar scent of salt from the Atlantic, and somewhere beyond the dark water a distant buoy bell rang softly in the night. Rex stood calmly next to him, watching the scene with quiet attention. The dog did not appear restless or anxious. Instead, he carried the same steady composure he had shown on countless missions years earlier, as though guiding Daniel to the hidden discovery had simply been another task completed with patience and care. Daniel reached down and rested his hand along the dog's back, feeling the slow rise and fall of Rex's breathing beneath his palm. The warmth of the contact felt real in a way that memories never could. For 3 long years, Daniel had believed that partnership had ended on a distant mission far from the quiet coastline of North Carolina. Yet the truth had walked back into his life through a single signal in the darkness. One bark. One familiar sound that refused to stay buried in the past. An officer eventually approached and spoke quietly with Daniel near the edge of the grass, thanking him for making the call and explaining that the situation was now under control. Daniel nodded calmly, listening without taking his eyes off the marsh for long. When the officer glanced down at the German shepherd beside him, his expression softened with quiet respect. "That dog saved people tonight without anyone even knowing it," he said. Daniel looked down at Rex again and gave a small nod of agreement. The German shepherd lifted his head slightly as if recognizing the tone of the conversation, though his attention quickly returned to the wide, open marsh where the wind moved through the tall reeds. Time passed slowly as the vehicles finished their work among the trees. Eventually the lights began to fade as the authorities prepared to leave the area secure and quiet once again. When the final truck disappeared through the forest path and the woods returned to darkness, only the moon and the whisper of wind remained. Daniel looked down at Rex and knelt beside him in the soft grass. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed the worn collar he had carried for years. The leather faded, but the metal tag still catching a faint glint of moonlight. For a moment, he simply held it in his hand while Rex watched with calm curiosity. Then Daniel gently fastened the collar around the dog's neck where it belonged. Rex stood patiently through the simple gesture, his tail giving a slow, quiet movement through the grass when the buckle clicked into place. Daniel rested his forehead lightly against the dog's head once more and closed his eyes for a brief moment of quiet gratitude. The night air moved around them with the steady rhythm of the ocean beyond the marsh. Some stories of loyalty do not end when people believe they are finished. Sometimes they wait quietly in the darkness until the right signal calls them home again.